Hello.
Thanks everybody for coming. My name is Erica Welch. I'm the librarian here at the Moore Free Library. And this is the penultimate workshop and talk and discussion in our month-long series of Death Coming to New Fame. I would love to know, I see some familiar faces who've been to a couple or more than a couple of the workshops, which is wonderful. I'm very glad to see you. And I was just wondering if you could, kind of by a show of hands, let me know where you heard about tonight's workshop. Front Porch Forum? Just in the library or library materials? Facebook? The Commons? The Reformer? The hospice mailing? A friend? Okay, great. Well, thanks all for coming. So tomorrow's the last event that we're having, and that's Deborah Lee Luskin, and she is giving a talk on how to write your own obituary, and that's at 1 o'clock tomorrow here. And like everything that we offer, it's free and open to the public, so I hope you'll come to that if you're so inclined. I wanted to let you know that Lee is being filmed tonight by Brattleboro area cable television, and it's for a documentary that's being made, but nobody in the audience is going to be filmed. However, if you could, if you have a question or a comment, if you could say it kind of loud so that it can get picked up, that would be great. And Lee will probably restate the question in her answer in hopes of, you know, making it flow once the movie comes out. So I'm going to introduce Lee Webster, who's here bringing Death Back Home, and she's the director of the New Hampshire, I can't remember the whole name of it, New Hampshire Funeral Resources Education and Advocacy Organization, but it's from Vermont.
Well, we're from New Hampshire.
Oh, okay.
I'm from Vermont.
Right.
So I speak Vermont. So hopefully we've got this all worked out. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And thanks everybody for coming. You know, another warm Friday night here. And thanks to the Newfane Library, the Moore Public Library. This is a pretty amazing event. I attend these things kind of all over the country, and it's really neat to have it happen right here. As I said, I'm a native Vermonter, but I'm a northern Vermonter. Grew up in Montpelier and lived all over the northern area. But I've been working with folks here in the Brattleboro area for the last couple of years, mainly through Michael Mayer here at Manitou, putting together Higher Ground, the conservation burial cemetery that we're hoping to get working pretty soon here. And we've also, I've done some trainings in home funeral, which is what we're going to be talking about tonight, with a group that has grown exponentially from a first a weekend workshop that we had, a year and a half ago, I think, December or so. And that group is still meeting. If any of you are interested in it, it's a Caring for Our Own group. And I'm going to talk about care committees so you'll understand a little bit more about what they do, and we'll go through that. But I want to say it's wonderful to be here. This is a really active community having to do with death matters, and this is important. It's us at a grassroots level making change in the way that we're approaching death and approaching funeral business. So that's kind of I'm supposed to introduce myself a little bit. I think that my #1 title is Funeral Reformer. At least I hope that's my #1 title. I've been very active for about the last 12 and a half or so years. I've been the past president of the National Home Funeral Alliance. I'm on my second run with, and this time as president of the Green Burial Council, which certifies green burial cemeteries throughout North America. I'm also on the board of the National End-of-Life Doula Alliance, so we'll talk a little bit about that piece. I'm trying to think what else. The New Hampshire group, I just left the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization. So you kind of get the idea here that all of these groups are working together in sync to make sure that all the pieces and parts of funeral reform and change are being touched on and that we're all on the same page. All very grassroots, but we're making some real inroads, and the funeral industry is sitting up and taking notice. So That's all good stuff. So basically, I tend in these groups to ask a couple of different questions. And when I'm out speaking to people, one of my questions is always, have you thought about your own funeral yet? And usually people's answer is a one-worder. Oh yeah, cremation, got it covered. Or, burial, family plot, yeah, all set. And they're missing the point that those are dispositions, those aren't funerals. There's a big distinction. And then the next piece they're going to say is what they tend to do is try to justify their choice. It's just so expensive to do things the way that we are, and it's so environmentally unfriendly and all of those kinds of things. So they're in the right ballpark about making choices. They just don't have the information yet. And the last piece is, I just don't have time for it. And I love that one, because I don't know about you, I'm a busy person, I'm always thinking I'll sleep when I'm dead. This is one thing you can't wait for. You really need to be making some plans. What all this means is that, we're approaching one of the most expensive, important decisions in our lives uninformed. And it's important for us to know all this stuff. Second question I ask people is, do you have your advance directives done, right? How many times have you heard that, been asked that, like a million times, right? And you either have the, yep, I've got it in the can, it's been there for 10 years, it's all good. Not good, probably. You may have picked out someone who's going to speak for you if you can't speak for yourself, and you probably have somebody set up to be the executor of your estate and take care of the finances. But how many of you have got somebody already appointed and they know the drill on what you want to have happen during that funeral period? Hand scratching, lipstick on a napkin, anything at all? No. We tend not to do that, right? My mom was a person who never ever wanted to talk about having to do with death at all. So the only way I could get anything out of her is that she was an NCIS addict, and so I would wait for that first few minutes during the NCIS episode, the beginning episode where somebody would die, and then I would say, well, that was an interesting way to go. Wonder what'll happen next. And wait for her to answer me, right? I never got the answer I was looking for. But it's the only way that I could approach the conversation. So we need to be approaching those conversations. You need to first of all let people know what it is you want. You need to know what you want, let people know about it, and then make sure that you include everyone in it. So that's my preach. Preach is over. But I have to say, after we've done answering those questions, that's when the interesting conversation happens for me, because I'm able to say to people, there's more to this than just where you're going to be buried or, what's going to happen next. The continuum of care is something that we in hospice use a lot. We talk about this a lot. Usually it has to do with the moment from diagnosis until death. We're expanding that view of what it means to have a continuum of care now, and it's happening very rapidly. If you have been diagnosed with a terminal illness, if you haven't completed your advance directives yet, that may give you time to do that. Most of us don't do life review until we really have to, right? We're not going to sit there and start writing wonderful things and creating music sets for people until we know that there's an audience for it. But with a diagnosis, terminal diagnosis, these are the things that kind of are starting to happen with more frequency. We're paying more attention to them. End-of-life doulas are instrumental in this, in working with families to create more important, all those important conversations that we all hope to have and maybe aren't able to get to. We've thought that hospice was carrying that, but hospice is carrying an enormous load. They can't be there for a dying vigil. They can't be there to sit with someone and go over what their plans are going to be or their life reviews. So end-of-life doulas are a complementary group of people who are coming and working with hospice to make sure that those pieces that hospice doesn't have time for get taken care of. So it becomes a much larger, fuller picture, a richer experience. After that, when the person dies, we no longer talk about funerals. Funeral always meant to me, oh, you go to a church service and then you're done, or maybe you go to the graveside, probably not. Now we're talking about the time of death until the disposition being the funeral period. And as we talk about home funeral, you see why that is so important. And then the disposition itself, again, that's sort of an end point. We could continue on into bereavement, but you get the general idea. And we have more people who are helping with all of these different parts. In the home funeral, or the funeral period, home funeral guides are versed in the law and in the ways that things work so that they can assist the family making their own decisions about what's going to happen next. So this continuum of care is always behind what we're thinking as we're moving our way through. So why home funerals and family burials? This is a favorite question of mine, and I've mulled it over for a very long time. The top 3 reasons that I have been able to discern are people choosing home funerals and home burial for financial reasons, which makes sense. They're also choosing them for environmental reasons, because we've become tuned in to what a big footprint. Direct cremation, where someone dies, you make a phone call, off they go, you get them back a couple days later in a box. We've lost the ritual aspect, we've lost the ceremonial aspect, and what home funeral does is bring that back. It forces us in a way to pay attention, to be present, to be in the moment, and that's what's really important. So one of the questions I get from people right about now, they're thinking, but isn't it illegal? Don't you have to be embalmed? Don't you have to hire a funeral director? And the answer, of course, is no, or else I wouldn't be here talking to you about it. We have the innate right to care for our own dead as human beings. We also have the legal right to care for our own dead in every state in the country. There are 9 states that are going to require that you hire a funeral director. People in those states have to hire a funeral director to do certain parts. But the one piece that you don't ever have to hire for is keeping or bringing your loved one home to your own home. That is sacrosanct. We can all do that. And here's the other piece. There are no funeral police. We all have this idea that we're all going to get caught with a dead body, right? We have a lot of fear around being caught with dead bodies, and there are good reasons for it. We've been brought up with an awful lot of mythology, and we're going to talk about some of that. What home funerals do is put us back in touch with the purpose of funerals, and that is knitting the family together again, knitting the community together again after that tear has formed with the loss of someone in that group. So another piece, it's not just the families who are stepping up to take care of loved ones now. We are creating community, very much like the group that I was talking about, the Caring for Our Own group right here in the Brattleboro area. What these groups are starting to do is go back to what were traditional practices, either in places of worship or in community or neighborhoods even. And what they're doing is either bringing back traditional ritual to create meaning, or they're creating new ritual. And I don't mean that in a religious way. I mean that we do things as human beings. We do sort of repetitive things, and we do things to mark the moment. And those are things that can be very spontaneous and organic. And we're finding our way there. We're doing much less hiring of someone else to read Psalm 23. We're coming up with other ways to honor our dead. What happens with all of this, whether you have a community group that is there to help support, the idea is that they're all trained. They know what to do to support the family when the family needs a little bit of a boost. Remember, not all of us are in families with 10 kids anymore. We're very mobile, so we might need help from our community to accomplish everything that has to be done. But they're there to support the family in doing it. What this does then is allow more flexibility during that funeral period. It also creates a natural flow for events and emotions. One of the things I hear constantly around the country from people is that there are people in the family who are not willing to go into the room where the deceased is lying in honor until about 3 in the morning, and then they'll get in there by themselves quietly. Widowers particularly will be the ones who will go in and lie next to their spouse for the last time. You can't do that if your loved one is across town. So it gives us that opportunity to just allow whatever that feeling is that's coming over us, to just express that and be part of that. And that's normal grieving, right? That's the way things were done less than 100 years ago. It also normalizes and diminishes fears, having all of the community members involved. It gives everyone a chance to participate and makes everyone feel useful. So setting up a situation like this, whether it's just with a family, with neighbors, with co-workers, with greater community, everyone feels connected. So we've served that purpose of HERO. And by doing this, we're allowing time for people to make meaning. Now, my meeting's different from your meeting. I might need a lot longer. I tend to have about a 2-year response time to losing someone in my life. I can't figure this out, but I do. Some people are at it right away, but I'm the one who'll wake up, 2 years later and just go, oh my God, so-and-so died. And I guess because I'm a coper. But having the time to actually take it all in, absorb it, right? We absorb what's happening when someone dies through all of our senses, not just hearing it on the phone or standing in a church and having somebody talk. We have a lot of different ways. One of the most powerful is smell, and we'll talk about that too. I do want to also address environmental concerns. Most of us who are clued into what goes on with embalming have a different idea about it. It is not legally required in any circumstance. And the things you need to know about it, of course, is that it's a highly invasive procedure. It removes all of the body fluids and replaces them with formaldehyde, methanol, dyes, surfactants, disinfectants, sulfur dioxide, benzene, you name it. Lots of neurological agents and so on. So it's not a very pretty thing. Those fluids that came out of the body also go right into the septic system or water treatment plant. There's no special, catapult to the moon for those pathogen-laden materials. What this creates is not a health hazard to us visiting someone who's been embalmed, certainly not to the person who has been embalmed, but it certainly is, it is a real health hazard for funeral directors and embalmers who have significantly high rates of, like 8 times higher rate of myeloid leukemia, 4 times higher risk of ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, 13 times higher risk of early death than the general population. So these things are not only, going in the ground, they're also affecting living people. We're concerned about all those. Although we are concerned also about pollution. We don't want to be continuing to put in, 1.6 million tons of concrete into the ground every year that will never go anywhere and do anything else. We've also, we're putting that in the form of vaults around the steel caskets or the exotic woods that are coming from South America in order to have a flat lawn so that nice grass can grow with all the herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers and so on. So you can see where I'm going with lawn cemeteries. It's not a pretty picture, and it's not sustainable, which sends a lot of people to cremation. The problem with that, of course, is that we emit mercury and other heavy metals up the stacks, and lots and lots of CO2. And it's also a danger to crematory operators, we are discovering. The other issue is that cremated remains are irreducible. They are in their lowest form, right? They're calcium phosphate and sodium. They're very heavy. If you put them on plants, they'll kill the plants. They're very dense. If you put them under plants, the roots will go anywhere they can to get away from them because they don't like undiluted salt, basically. So cremated remains is our last issue. How do we dispose of that? So we're creating another problem there. Before we go, though, I want to just mention Aretha here. This is Aretha Franklin. Any of you watch her? Any of her? It was absolutely marvelous. The music, it went all day. I mean, it just had that wonderful flavor of, people really stopping to pay attention to the moment. But what I loved about it was the fact that they changed her clothes 3 times. She was heavily embalmed here. Other people made that choice for her because she did not do her advance directive. And now I've been following the legal battles. It's pretty fascinating. There's a lot going on with that. But yeah, lots of embalming there. So here's we're in a library, so I thought I'll tell you a couple stories. And this is my mom. You can see we look just alike.
How old is she here?
I think she was 11 or 12. And if you could see my 11-year-old granddaughter, you would go, wow, that's pretty amazing. But my mom was 86, I think, when she died. I had been caring for her from a distance for quite a while, and I was finally able to get her into my home and onto hospice service. So she died in my sunroom after 3 weeks of care on hospice. And she was a real stickler. If you floated her a buck, believe me, it was coming back to you. There was no fooling around. She was one of those people who, went with the old superstitions. If you gave anyone something sharp, you had to give them a penny. Do you know these? If you gave someone a wallet or a pocketbook or anything that contained something, you gave them a penny. So very frugal and very money conscious. She would have absolutely loved what we did with her. Basically, she died at home on hospice service. None of that cost us any money. She wanted to be cremated because she had had my father cremated 5 years earlier, so we went with her wishes. And in order to be cremated in St. Johnsbury, which is where we took her, we had to have the permit completed in the state of New Hampshire where she died. So it has to be in the state where the person died. You obtain that crematory permit. That costs $60 for the medical examiner to come to the house. Went and filed a death certificate, got the transport permit, $0. Certified copies cost us about $36 so that we could inform the bank and the insurance company what was going on. We took care of her, we bathed her, we powdered her right up in her Jean Naté powder, that smell that everybody in the family associated with her. And they walked in the room every time and they said, oh, it's really her. It still feels like her. I can smell it. It's still her. Very powerful for my siblings particularly. Cost us nothing. Her shroud cost $4. I found a cotton sheet that was really lovely and we wrapped her in the cotton sheet. We had an alternate container, which you have to have, which is a large cardboard box. They're not that difficult to find, but that's $35. And then the cremation itself costs $350. So my mom's entire death did not cost the $10,000 to $12,000 that most people are paying these days if they go with a burial. It cost less than $500, and she would have been pretty thrilled about that. So here are the basics around home funerals. They're just very common sense things. The number one thing, and this is the language of the law, is that the family retains custody and control. All right? And that means that if they die in the home, you simply keep them home. If they die in a hospital or a nursing facility, you bring them home. It's that simple. You can file the death certificate, as I did, obtain the transport permit very easily. That happens in the town where the person died, so that's all good. You're going to, what the funeral industry calls shelter, we're going to shelter people for any mandatory wait periods. If you're going with cremation in the state of Vermont, you have to wait 24 hours from the time the person died until they can push the button in the retort. All right, so that's called sheltering somewhere. We call it home vigil. We simply keep that person home a little bit longer instead of spending thousands of dollars for that person to be lying somewhere else, because that's all they're going to be doing. In New Hampshire, if anybody's from New Hampshire, it's 48 hours. It's different in each state. You can make your own casket. As we did, you can make your own shroud. You can make your own urns if you want to go that way. Or you can find someone in your community who makes these things. You can purchase them online. You can do all kinds of things. You don't have to go to a funeral home and purchase funerary products. It's sort of a sideline for them. It's always has been, but it's not necessary. And I urge people to shop local and support your local artists. You know, get somebody. I have a beautiful shroud that, in fact, I had one made for myself. It's a green linen, and my sister-in-law loved it so much. She's a red hat lady. So we had a red one made with purple ribbons that close it up, and she had me take a picture of her in it from my balcony, and then she used the picture for a Christmas card that year. So, you know, you can have a lot of fun with this. I know a lot of people who have made their own caskets and they use them as bookshelves or, you know, but a friend of mine actually has it in her kitchen. It's part of her kitchen unit. But, you know, it's at the ready anytime they need it. You can transport the body yourself. I fit the whole container right into a Prius. You can do it. And you can make your own disposition arrangements. Basically, when you hire a funeral director to make those arrangements, they're just making a phone call to make an appointment. You need to find, if you're going with cremation, you need to find a crematory that's willing to accept from the body from the family, as long as you've got the paperwork, which of course you're going to have, but you're going to cross all your T's and dot your I's. But you can make those phone calls. You can call your town cemetery sexton and make those appointments as well. So that's basically, that's a home funeral as far as the nuts and bolts are concerned right there. Those care communities, back to them again. Again, we're recovering that lost tradition of communities caring for each other and creating those support networks. The other thing that they can do to help is to provide alternate space. A lot of people don't have enough room to lay a body out and have people come in and out, right? So maybe a friend could manage to host this in their home, maybe in a place of worship as well. So you don't have to be just in the home, but that's part of the strength of having a whole community of people who are involved with this, is that they'll all work this solution together. And the side effect here, again, about building community is that if you belong to a community of faith, then those congregations get strengthened at the same time too. So back to the body care, let's talk a little bit more about that. This is, again, pretty simple. We are as non-invasive as we can be. We don't wire teeth together. We don't super glue eyes or lips or any of that stuff. We don't, plug orifices. We don't need to do any of those things. Essentially, if we want the eyes to be closed, we might put, like my yoga, rice bags on the eyes, put a little bit of pressure on those, and they will stay fairly well closed. If they don't, I can tell you from experience that a ball cap and some sunglasses can really take care of that half-mast eye thing if it's bothering you. The other piece is that, those of us who are working with the dying and the dead are usually pretty okay with people looking dead. We're not trying to make them look as though they're sleeping. They have, in most cases that I've been involved with, again, mostly hospice cases, I can speak to personally, there's just a certain peace that comes once the death and the struggle is over, if there was a struggle. So it's kind of exciting to see. It's almost like seeing a newborn and trying to figure out what their face is going to look like. When someone dies, their face takes on a whole new expression, and you don't know what it's going to be until you see it. So trying to change that and make them look as they make an 80-year-old look as though they were 35 doesn't make a lot of sense to us. However, if they were a person who wore makeup and all that kind of thing, we can certainly do that. And things like washing the hair can be that last, just that last gesture of love to a person. How we all love to have our scalps massaged and to have clean hair. It's just a lovely thing to do. If the lower jaw, of course, no longer has the ability to stay in place. So we'll do something like this, sort of the Jacob Marley approach, where we will pull a scarf around or use a travel pillow or roll up a towel or something, just long enough for that to set. That's pretty easy. We're going to usually bathe the body there for a couple of reasons. One is to remove that surface bacteria. We want people to be clean and fresh. And there's also a ritual aspect to it, even if it's just parts of the body. There's a marvelous program called the One Washcloth Project. And this is in hospitals. I have friends who thought of this, nurses who thought of this. That when someone dies in the hospital, they often, they're trying to move the body quickly and they're trying to, do what they do, get them to the morgue and all that kind of stuff. And what they're asking is for families to have the opportunity to be given a warm washcloth and to go and wash the face and the hands of their loved one before they're removed. It's one of the most impactful things that we can do for families, particularly if those things happen in the hospital and this was a tragic circumstance or an unanticipated death. Being able to take that moment in an institutional environment it changes their experience completely. So even bathing a little bit has that marvelous effect. We use those different familiar scents as I'm talking about, or lavender or essential oils, or nothing at all. But we do want to clean the body. Dressings, sometimes there are skin perforations or something like that. This is one of the things that people are afraid of, won't they bleed and all that kind of stuff. No, we're not worried about that, but we do want to make sure that the skin is intact, particularly if somebody has had bed sores or something. So we take wax paper, and the wax paper pretty much adheres right to whatever the sore is. It's biodegradable. It works just as well as anything else, and we're not putting any more harsh, latex or anything else on people. And we keep the body cool. We open the window in the winter. We, put on the AC if we need to. We have cooling vests. We have things, we have dry ice. I tend not to find that a lot in New England, unless you're by the seashore where they use it for fish. But we have this wonderful product called Techni-Ice, and this is the flat version of it. But these are polymers that activate when you crunch it all up and you submerge it in water. And these stay cool on a body like this, perhaps across this way, and we want to do it on the back as well. And that helps cool the core of the body down to room temperature a little more quickly. You can switch these out, put them in your freezer, bring them back, reuse them. So it's a wonderful product. But that's the key, clean and cool. And we can keep people, in Britain it's very common to keep people for up to 2 weeks. So our fear of dead bodies and disease and all is one of the things that holds us back from keeping our loved ones home. So this is one of those myths that got set up in the 1930s when the marketing business took off in the 30s and 40s, particularly with the funeral industry. A lot of things that had converged. It wasn't that they were doing it to be difficult, but a lot of things had converged at that point. Germ theory was finally proven. People were dying in hospitals instead of on the family farm from machinery failures. All kinds of things are happening at this time. Physicians are now professionals, and funeral directors are trying to be professionals too. So the idea that that dead bodies were dangerous sort of evolved out of that convergence of new ideas. There was also the great fear that we were in danger from them, so there's an awful lot of information out there about, you had to buy this particular type of casket in order to keep them from being able to get out because they were ghouls and they were going to come after us. It's fascinating to look at all those old advertisements. But here's the thing, if you're still worried about bodies being dangerous, in the U.S., in most circumstances, we're really not having problems around this. If someone had MRSA or something like that could be communicable, if you were taking care of someone with this, you were probably using gloves, some kind of universal precaution. You simply continue to. But most people, if they didn't die of something that you could catch, we aren't going to catch anything now. So if you're still worried, this is what the Center for Infectious Disease says. They say the mere presence of a dead body without regard to its embalmed status and one that's not leaking blood from an open wound or perforation does not pose an increased health risk of infectious disease. It's kind of the long way around what the Pan American Health Organization has to say, which is the microorganisms that are involved in decomposition are not the kind that cause disease. Pure and simple. If you go to the World Health Organization, the Center for Disease Control, they all have some kind of statement that is to reassure us that it's okay for us to stay with our dead a little bit longer. Okay, so now we're not afraid of being arrested, right? Not going to get in trouble, no funeral police, and we are not going to get hurt because there's really nothing wrong with these dead bodies. So what else could go wrong? Here's one of the things that can go wrong. And by the way, I want to talk about this really, really quickly. Practicing getting up and down stairs if you have someone who dies on an upper floor, it's critically important. This is one of the logistics you need to be thinking about if you're having a home funeral. The first one I ever got called into was about a 300-pound man in an upstairs bedroom, had died unexpectedly, and the staircase was one of those wrought iron circular things. Okay? Thank you, paramedics. That's how we got him down over the edge on a bodyboard. Knowing how to move people around and having enough people to move around is a bit of a science. So it's good to be thinking about that. So that's one of the things that can certainly get in the way is that you didn't plan properly. But that's a whole other thing. One other issue is if you're going to be filing your own paperwork, there are places in Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, where the town clerk is only available to the public, on Tuesday from 2 to 4 at her kitchen table. So you might have problems with getting in time, in the amount of time that the government wants you to get in there. Again, no funeral police, nobody's keeping a stopwatch on what happens. And in fact, in New Hampshire, there's a 36-hour rule about moving the body and so on. So, and I had someone who died on a Saturday morning, early morning, and then we had Martin Luther King Day on Monday, and we had an ice storm, and then we had a cleanup from the ice storm, and we didn't get in to file it until Thursday, and nobody went to the Moose Cow. In Vermont, we have something, and we'll talk about the preliminary report of death in Vermont, and that eliminates that fear of being caught moving bodies before you get the death certificate filed. Another piece that, so you want to make friends, is what I'm saying. You want to make friends with your town clerk, or like all the town clerks in your area if you can, so that they'd be willing to come in and help you process that death certificate. It takes very little time, but they have to be able to do it electronically to the state vital statistics, so you want to have people on your side. Another piece are institutional policies that you might run into. Some hospitals and care facilities have their own policies that are not compliant with the law. So the law says that you can go with the right permits, you can go to the hospital and pick up your loved one and leave without having to do a Little Miss Sunshine thing. Nobody has to be pushed out a window. But you might run into some policies that the hospital has inadvertently usually put in place that say that they'll only release the body to a funeral director because they don't know that the family and the next of kin are really the ones with the legal authority. So they just don't know. So getting to your local hospital and making sure that that their policies for body release are intact, or compatible with home funeral is a good thing. All of us can be doing. We can be advocating in our own community. Same thing with the care facility. Just find out ahead of time. One of the other things people run into is running around trying to find the physician of record to sign the cause of death. So you might, if you have hospice, they'll often be very helpful in tracking down the doctor and getting that signature for you. Otherwise, particularly in a large hospital, you might be responsible for running around and getting that. That can be a bit of a problem, but people usually get it done. Another is body condition, because we're all not dying beautifully and peacefully in our beds. So, I've had a lot of people say, well, what happens if you have a tissue donation, organ donation, or there's an autopsy? Obviously, those are things that are going to slow down the process, but they don't preclude the idea of having a home funeral. You can still have a home funeral. There's a 24-year-old motorcycle accident victim that I know of down on Cape Cod a few years ago. The entire town came out when his body was returned, and the whole town came out and they did a procession down Main Street. Everybody there. And he had PVC pipe because they'd removed all of his long bones. And they'd done every organ and every type of donation they possibly could. They still had a very public, very meaningful home funeral and a procession to the cemetery. So it can be done. If you run into a medical examiner situation, just tell them what you're planning and they'll help you. It's that simple. Biggest rule, the family is always in charge. Even if we have all these other helpers, they're still in charge. So let's delve into all the details. Who really is in charge of that body? We say the family, but the family is the extension of the next of kin. So who's the actual next of kin? Interestingly enough, in Vermont, it's a designated agent. And there's a form here for a designated agent if you choose to have someone other than your next of kin be in charge of your funeral plans, those ones you're going to write when you get home, you're going to think about and write down and talk to people about. Right. The second person is your spouse. And we kind of know this, right? Because it's always the spouse who goes to the funeral home to make the plans. But when we talk about home funeral, people go, oh my gosh, but who's really in charge? Well, this is pretty easy. The state even guides us through it. In Vermont, it's a majority of the children. If there's an only child, obviously they're going to do it. If a parent isn't available, but it has to be the majority of children who agree. After that, it goes to custodial parents and all of that kind of stuff, and it continues along here in all different ways of descending order of kinship. So that's pretty much what you're looking at. It might go to guardian, or then, if we run out of people, it's to anyone who's willing to do it, right? It goes beyond that then to the state actually appointing a funeral director to take over and just do it. Here's the one person who never gets to make a decision about what happens to your body after you die, and that's your ex. A lot of people breathe a pretty big sigh of relief about that. Filing the paperwork. So this is that preliminary report of death. This is different from the death certificate, but it basically has the essential information on it in order to be able to move the body, to transport the body, so that you don't have to wait for in Vermont for the town clerk's office to be open. All right, so there is this backup plan in place. As far as the death certificate is concerned and about the information that's on here, we have a worksheet for that. Because when you fill out a death certificate, you're not allowed to cross anything out or white anything out. It has to be perfect in black ink on that death certificate. So you get one chance. So we suggest you complete the death worksheet, death certificate worksheet, and keep that with your advance directives. And where do you keep your advance directives? In your freezer. Because everyone will remember where that is. I can tell you after years and years of going to see my father-in-law, and every time before we left, I said, okay, let me show you where everything is. He lived to be 102. He started doing this in his 60s. I finally said, look, can we just put it in the freezer? Because then we'll never forget where anything is. And it works. And if the house burns down, there's a 50-50 chance you're still going to have some paperwork left. Maybe, right?
Maybe.
Maybe. So basically what you have to do here, you acquire that signature from the doctor or the medical examiner, whoever that person is, the hospice nurse, and you're going to complete the demographics section, which is really personal information that only you know, right? As a family member, only you know this stuff. So if you hire a funeral director and you pay them, thousands of dollars to file the paperwork for you, you're telling them what to put on a form that if you can write well enough without having to scratch it out, you could do for free. You're going to file that with the town clerk where the death occurs, and then you're going to get that permit, or you're going to have your prod, which is going to allow you to go ahead and move. You're going to complete an authorization form if you're going to cremate, or you're going to take that same transport burial permit. It's dual, works for both, and you're going to take that to the town clerk after the body is buried. And you can obtain those certified copies from any town clerk, actually in the state once it's in the system. And I recommend that people just get them as they need them, rather than buying a whole bunch, because they're expensive and there's no need to have them sitting around in a drawer. You can notify Social Security or Veterans Affairs yourself. Veterans Affairs in Vermont is fantastic. They're wonderful. They will help you start to finish through the entire process. You can have military honors. You can do all kinds of things with this. And if I forget to say this, home burial as well, you can arrange to have military honors at home. So, and Social Security, whether or not you file it, if you have somebody else file it for you, check within 30 days to see that it was done correctly. Because I think if anybody saw the 60 Minutes piece a few years ago, There are people who have been declared dead who are definitely not dead, but they no longer have a life because they've been declared dead by the government. So make sure they get it right so that you can get right in the process right away. So if you're going to have a home funeral and you have someone who is at home, you have an anticipated death. Only two kinds. There's anticipated and unanticipated. An anticipated death, often if you're on hospice service, it's great. Who do you call for an authority? You call the hospice nurse. You don't call 911, you don't call the doctor, you call the hospice nurse, and they come and pronounce. Right? So that kickstarts the whole death certificate process. Everything else kind of falls right along. If you're under a doctor's care but with a known condition, you're still going to have to call an authority, but you don't have to call 911 again. We still don't call 911. Someone's died. We know what they died of for the most part. We're going to just call the general, what we used to call dispatch. I say this all the time. Does everybody recognize dispatch? You know what that is? Yeah, we've gotten so used to 911 is the only thing you do. Everything's an emergency. Death is not an emergency, particularly if it's anticipated. So what we're going to do is just call the police station and say, someone just died. We were expecting it. Would you please, send someone out? That's it. And then they'll go from there, and they'll call the medical examiner, and everything will kind of follow right along. But it's not in a big emergency. If it's unanticipated death, but they're clearly dead, you're not going to call, you're not going to call 911 if that person is already, changed color, they're cold, they're clearly dead. There's no emergency. Again, you're not going to call 911. You're going to, again, call that non-emergency line and explain what has happened. And again, they'll send out the medical examiner. So, the only time you're really calling 911 is to call in the cavalry to come in and start, crunching chests and all that kind of stuff, which is great if that person, you really aren't expecting them to be dying right now, and there's a chance of bringing them back. That chance, by the way, is about 4%. But that's the time when you call 911. I know a lot of people who say, look, if you find me and I'm not breathing, go to a movie, come back later. They don't want to go through all of this kind of stuff. So that's the way it works. Those do not resuscitate orders, DNRs, doctors have to prepare those for you. So if you want one, you have to go through that process. You can't just say, yeah, don't do anything to me. If you've written it in your advance directives that you don't want any heroic measures, that's great as long as somebody has the advance directives in their hands. If they don't, then nobody knows what you wanted. So another reason why you have to tell people about it. So next thing is blended funerals, and I have mentioned funeral directors a couple times here. Most of us are more comfortable hiring a professional to help us. That's just the way things are these days. We just aren't used to taking care of everything ourselves. We haven't been doing it. We've been outsourcing it for so long. It feels like the norm, and there's no problem with that. If you want to hire a funeral director to file that paperwork for you, if you're uncomfortable with it, you're afraid of making a mistake, if you don't want to put someone in your truck or your Prius, then you might hire them to do the transport for you. They're going to charge you whatever they're going to charge you. They are allowed by the Federal Trade Commission, which oversees the funeral industry, to discount services. But a lot of them, they'll just say, oh gosh, if all you want me to do is drive them from the hospital to your house, here's what I'll charge you to do. So they can be your best friend, particularly if someone died far away and needs to be moved. They know how to deal with common carriers and transport services and all that kind of thing. There are lots of extenuating circumstances, things like reconstruction and so on. So make friends with your local funeral director, find the funeral director of your choice, shop around, just like you shop around for anybody else. We kind of treat them like hairdressers, right? We don't want to go to another one, we might be accused of being unfaithful. But the fact is, they're funeral directors are professionals like anyone else. You get to choose. One way to figure out if you're concerned about costs, you can go to the Funeral Consumers Alliance, and the Vermont chapter has recently updated their survey of funeral directors' pricing. And you can go on there and take a look at people in your area and see how they stack up price-wise. That's one way to make a decision. Another group that's important to bring into this are clergy. A lot of people will hire a minister because, first of all, they think it's legally required. Of course, it's not. But they do it because, it seems like the right thing to do. Well, we have some other categories here now that weren't around before. Obviously, hospice chaplains would be willing to continue to serve the family after the death has occurred. But we have another group called celebrants who are being trained all over the country in non-denominational service, so they can help. They're mostly storytellers. They'll come in and learn from the family what the stories are and assist the family in creating their own service that makes that has real meaning for them. They may do some of the speaking or reading or orchestrating music or whatever it might be, or they might simply assist the family in doing it. But celebrants are there are more and more of them around, and a nice alternative if that's what you're looking for. Transportation is another issue. Again, we've touched on this a little bit, but as I said, if you have that permit, you can travel, go anywhere you want. I always tell people that my husband's a real boat guy. He's got a boat that he treks all the way to Squam Lake, because we can't live on Squam Lake, but he can boat on it. And he heads over there and checks things out a lot, and he wants me to go, but I have terrible motion sickness, so I've never been on the boat. I told him if he gets the right permit, he can take me to all of his favorite fishing coves before he heads me off to the Green Burial Cemetery. So that's all good. The other thing he can do is drive me back and forth to my beloved Vermont and back to New Hampshire. And again, no funeral police, nobody stopping to check the trunk for dead bodies when you cross from here to Maine or Mass or New Hampshire. So no problem with state lines. We do recommend that you have a closed vehicle of some kind. In some states it's okay to just have people in the back of the truck, but it doesn't work so well. And you do need a few people for carrying, as you can see. Usually 4 to 6 people. It's pretty simple. And we've gone from the shiny shoes pallbearers to anyone who wants to be in the power seat. And what often happens, this is a procession to a green burial site. And what will happen is that people will stop and switch out so that everyone has an opportunity to carry that person to their final destination. This is another one of those things. When I was talking about ritual, this is a really big one. What's happening in some of the major cemeteries around the country is that they're filling up. They have no more room. They're trying to buy land so they can put more concrete in the ground, but once they do that, it's filled up and it's gone. What they're doing now is stopping the family at the gate, taking the body and burying it, and the family's not allowed to come anymore. In natural burial cemeteries, green burial cemeteries, it is understood that you are going to, that the family and the friends are going to participate, and in very hands-on way. Doing processionals, bringing the loved one in, perhaps being part of the ceremony that occurs at graveside. And we don't just have one shovel or one handful of dirt that goes into the grave. We tend to have lots of shovels and pint-sized shovels for children as well, so that everyone has an opportunity to fully participate in bringing this person back to the earth. So these are ways that we are more in the moment and more participatory. This is a story I want to tell you about. Max was 4.5 years old, a little boy in Oregon. And I just got to meet his mom recently, and we're working on some major projects in Oregon, working with the medical examiner's office and developing new websites so that other people will have the support that his mom did not have. Max was found in their pond. He'd wandered away when the babysitter was there, and she discovered his neoprene boots floating in the hole in the middle of the pond. The parents came, jumped in, tried to find him, couldn't get him. They had paramedics who arrived quickly, got in, got him out, but it was, of course, way too late. When they were trying to bring Max home to their ranch for the home funeral and the burial on the property, In fact, right next to where his grandmother is laid to rest in the family cemetery. They were told by the medical examiner that they could not do it, it was illegal. And you can imagine the grief of this family. And so they went along with it, and it wasn't until long after they fought very hard finally, and they got him on the family truck and were able to drive him home for the service. But they didn't have that holding and touching time of the home funeral piece. And Kelia went to town on this once she was able to come up for air to discover that it was absolutely legal for her to have taken him home in the family car. So her mission is to make sure that no other Oregon family is given misinformation by authorities who should know better, but don't. This is not the first time I've run into a story like this. When I first got involved with this work, about 12 or so years ago, I went immediately to the vital statistics office in Concord, New Hampshire, and went to the desk and said to the receptionist, "I'd like to see a death certificate." But you can't see them. They're sort of a secret thing. "I'd just like to see a sample." "Why would you want that?" "Well, in case I have a family that wants to have a home funeral." And she said, "Oh, you can't do that." I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, because bodies have to be embalmed." I said, "Can I see your supervisor?" And 10 minutes later, the head of vital statistics came through the door. And the story goes on, but the piece is that people in positions of authority don't know what's legal and what isn't. So we have to empower ourselves and empower each other so that things like this don't happen again. Home burial in Vermont. This is one that I did in New Hampshire, and this is lovely because this is one of my hospice patients. I was asked in to advise them about funeral planning and what they, their question was, which funeral director should we use? At the end of a 40-minute conversation, they had gone from who are we going to have to call and how in the world are we going to be able to afford it, to yes, we're going to keep Dad home, we're going to bathe his body, take care of him, we're going to call the neighbors, we have a neighbor with a small bucket loader, and we're going to have him buried behind the farmhouse where the family had been for 4 generations. And we're going to bury him by the stone wall that he helped build with his grandfather. And everyone in the neighborhood's going to come. And sure enough, that's what they did. It was seamless, lovely. It didn't cost a penny. And that was important to them. It was part of their stress. So what they did, and what we can do, is bury the body at whatever depth we want to. In Vermont, you're expected to bury it at about 3.5 feet. That is the minimum. The reason for that is that we want an 18 to 24 inch smell barrier above the body. We call it the smell barrier because people are afraid that wild animals are going to dig people up, and the fact is that they really don't care about us, they're not interested. It's way too much work. And what we also do is we have that 24 inches up to the horizon. We also mound the soil then over the top, so we have another additional couple of, foot or 2. So the only wild animals who come are the skunks who like to mark their territory, like to let everybody else know it's theirs because they want all those freshly turned grubs. But 3.5 feet is fine, and you can do that. When you bury on your own property, you can make your own rules too. The Vermont statute explicitly permits home burials for immediate family members only. You can't just open up your property to anybody. So you're creating a family cemetery on your property when you bury someone. While we were working on the legislation here, and I testified at the legislature for this particular bill, as a matter of fact, and I hoped that it was the thing that swayed them. After I had done lots of research around the country to discover what the setbacks were in every other state, because Vermont had this marvelous setback, or these setback requirements of about 50 feet to this, to water, and 100 feet to that, and so on. Very reasonable kinds of setbacks that the rest of the country has been adopting for years. When we went back in to change the burial depth, the legislators working on this bill became very concerned about those setbacks having to do with water, so they actually made them more stringent. We have a sheet here about this, that I put together for you that has all of the numbers, so you don't have to write them down or anything. You'll be able to find them. There's also a wonderful piece that's put out by the Secretary of State's office, and they've just recently updated it after this law was passed, called Digging Deep, and you can find that. You'll find a sheet there, and you'll find the link to go and download that yourself. But it'll lay out for you that they've changed the numbers up to about 200 feet up gradient of a drilled well. I love the terminology here. Up gradient and down gradient. 500 feet from other types of groundwater. 150 feet cross or down gradient from groundwater. All these types of things. And then it continues on with flood hazard areas and so on. And I very much appreciate it. Vermont has always been a leader in environmental issues having to do with pollution and water. I know because I had an uncle who was the head of natural resources many, many years ago. He's the guy who got the bottle ban thing going in Vermont. In fact, styled after Oregon, which was the first state that did it. So I appreciate Vermont's paying attention to all of these. What's interesting is that there is a handful of states that even have any kind of setback for any kind of cemetery, no less a natural burial cemetery. And one of the things you need to know about that that's really helpful, I think, for people to get on board with this is that of all the studies that have been done that I've been able to find and other scientists have been able to come up with who are helping me find this language, those studies point to the fact that any pollution, any what we call plume from cemeteries, from graves, has to do with the stuff we're putting in the ground with the body, not the body. We can't prove that, we can't find anything from bodies that we can identify and say, yep, those bodies are creating pollution here. It's all about the artifacts, or what we call the furniture that goes in the ground, right? We're working right now at the Green Burial Council to get a couple of different research projects up so that we can prove once and for all in the over 100, 200, we're about 250 natural burial cemeteries in the US and Canada right now, and they're coming online as fast as they can. I have 18, just got another one last night, 18 conservation burial cemeteries that are trying to come online right now across the country. All right, and that's the up ante right there. Conservation burial is the gold standard here for natural burial. So we're very excited. It means we're working with land trust alliances and conservation groups, very much like the Manitou group is trying to do with Higher Ground. Having that conservation partner so that we're doing all of this work in tandem, and we're following best practices and principles is really critically important to making this safe. But we're also, as I was saying, we're going to do these research projects so that we can prove from actual burial sites what that layer of plume is. For the most part, bodies tend to be decomposed by at that 3.5 foot level. All those microbes and those coffin beetles and all that wonderful stuff that's happening there, it is keeping the body in place and simply turning it into compost, right? So we're not expecting to find plume, but we want to prove that for sure. So conservation burial level is really important. The reason that I bring that up particularly is that home burial is great if you need to save some money. If you have the land's been in your family for a long time, there's a real sentimental reason, there's a heritage reason for burying on your own property. There are a lot of reasons to bury on your own property. But the one question I ask people is to think about what other things might be involved in this decision. Some people are concerned about, won't it devalue my property? The answer to that we've been able to discover is no. A lot of people really like the idea of having, particularly in New England, we like the idea of having family cemeteries. Right? Again, it's the heritage, it's the tradition piece. And if there's an established cemetery on your property, you're good to go. It's a cemetery. You can bury in it. The biggest concern that I have is if we all start burying on our own property, we aren't furthering those conservation goals. And we have to think back to the reason for why cemeteries became cemeteries to begin with. right? If you had a family farm, sure, it was normal, you know, to bury your own right there, or to bury in the church if that's what you were, you know, that's what you were looking to do. But those still became places where we had groups rather than single bodies laid out in different places. And we need to, I'm not saying one way is better than the other, but I am concerned that people make this decision for the right reasons, and for reasons that they feel good about afterwards. And one of the things that makes people feel good often is to be burying on conservation land, so that the body, the fees that you pay, which by the way are quite modest usually compared to standard cemeteries, about $4,000 less on average in the U.S. But that what's happening with those fees is that they're supporting life-affirming activities that are occurring above ground. Because we're using conservation land not just to bury bodies, we're using it for recreational purposes. You know, people are coming there to walk and to meditate and to bird watch and to cross-country ski and to have family picnics and yoga days and bringing the dog days and, you know, all those types of things. I mean, you know, a lot of people in these in conservation cemeteries, like Ramsey Creek in South Carolina, which was the first one in the U.S. In 1998. And they're doing more baptisms and weddings than they are actual full-body burials. You know, people are really getting it, and younger generations are particularly understanding this. And it's really exponential, the interest in natural burial now, particularly at the conservation level. So I want you to be thinking about that when you're thinking about the trade-off for home burial at the same time. The other things you might have to do with home burial too, you're going to file that burial permit back with the town clerk. I think we mentioned that earlier, but I wanted to say that. The other thing that's important to do is create an access easement. And that doesn't mean that you have to build anything. It just means you have to have, you know, we're back to that lipstick on a napkin. You have to have something where you say, park your car here, walk over my property here to get to the grave in the future. So that's an easy thing to do. So those are those two topics for you. I do want to push you toward some of these organizations that I was talking about earlier, because you'll find scads of important information, both general information for around the country, and in New Hampshire you're going to find a lot of things. There's a page there for Vermont as well. There is the Green Burial Vermont group that hasn't quite got their website built up yet, but hopefully that's going to have more information that is Vermont specific. Again, the Funeral Consumers Alliance also has a chapter here. So there are an awful lot of people to reach out to and get the answers to any questions that you have. And that's what I've got for you. I do want to give Michael a chance to tell us a little bit more about what's happening with the conservation burial cemetery that he's working to get online right now, because as I was saying before, Brattleboro is really on fire about this stuff. It's amazing to me how many people are keyed in and want to be part of this. And I want to have Michael talk to you about what's happening with that.
Thank you, Lee. What has happened is since a couple of years ago, when really the Caring for Our Own group started to meet around all of these issues that Lee has been discussing, we simultaneously have been creating a new nonprofit 501c3 organization called the Higher Ground Conservation Cemetery Association that is on the verge of two important developments. Number one, it is being given 5 acres of land that will be used explicitly for the purpose of conservation burials. Number one. Number two, in order for that to become operational, the town of Newfane needs to add 5 words to the existing zoning ordinance. Those 5 words are to allow natural burial grounds into a resource district or conservation district. Currently, a petition has been circulated that exceeds the minimum number necessary for the Town of Newfane Select Board to actually approve the bylaw, which would allow for natural burial grounds, in which case we could proceed to go forward. It indicates that there's really a very strong interest in the township, the villages of Newfane, South Newfane and Williamsville, to actually do all these things that Lee has been talking about, the life-affirming activities as well as the conservation value of supporting indigenous species, of doing what is right for the specimen trees that we want to save on land which is already conserved by the Vermont Land Trust as it works out up on Sunset Lake Road. So I would just like to urge people who are interested in following these nonprofits, the Higher Ground Conservation Cemetery Association will be putting up a website soon, and there'll be more announcements as to what will be necessary. A public hearing will be announced sometime soon to actually consider what the select board will be looking at in order to proceed.
Why not just apply for a variance rather than change the ordinance?
We went before the Newfane Development Review Board, and as sympathetic as they were, they didn't see precedent to make a decision that would support the variance or conditional use. So that's why it was kicked into the longer process of actually changing the zoning. Believe me, we would have liked to have gone that route, but it wasn't in the cards at this time. What is exciting now is this process. This process is being documented, and film footage now is actually demonstrating this process so that it can become a roadmap for other towns in the state of Vermont and elsewhere who are looking to do this kind of thing. It's a grassroots effort, really, to figure out how something like this can be a viable and exciting alternative to what we can conventionally understand the burial process to be.
I would add to that I'm aware of at least 3 other green burial cemeteries that are coming online in the state of Vermont. And East Calais, Vermont, right in my old stomping grounds, is already, or Calais, Vermont, I'm sorry, Robinson Cemetery in Calais, Vermont, 10 miles outside of Montpelier, is already burying green. So it's happening. It's just, there are different levels of cemeteries. We've been talking about conservation level because that hopefully is what's going to happen for you here, which will be a huge milestone. We also have hybrid cemeteries, which are conventional cemeteries who simply create space where they bury without a vault and they do other things. We have natural burial cemeteries, people who start up a cemetery and they simply, follow all of these organic rules. No, they use biodegradable containers of any kind, shrouds or caskets, no toxic chemicals, no vaults. The body is simply put back into the ground. So it's happening at various levels in places all over the country, and Vermont right now is right on the cusp of joining the wave, which is pretty exciting. Does anybody have questions about the home funeral piece or the home burial piece? Hopefully that answered a lot of questions. Yeah.
You had said that the waiting period for cremation is 24 hours in Vermont. Is there a waiting period from death in the home till burial in the ground?
No.
So you can just go right
No, you can move right along. Yeah, it's really interesting. That's the way it works everywhere. Andy of Mayberry was buried on his own property. He died, Andy Griffiths died a couple of years ago, and the family had him buried. And he died, I guess, early in the morning, and the family had him buried on the property by 5 o'clock that afternoon. Everyone gathered, everyone was with him, everyone processed through his own property and laid him to rest. Very, very interesting stuff.
Lee, another logistical question. Is there a threshold that you have to meet in getting a dead body out of the house and into the ground, or because that's another piece of misinformation.
Yes,
there are some people who feel desperate that we really have to move this body quickly. Could you speak a little?
Yeah, as I was saying before, as long as the body is cleansed and cool, we can keep them for long periods of time. I mean, generally, what's going to happen, again, cause of death, right, condition of the body at the time, right, those are 2 different things, but both need to feed into how long a body can really be kept above ground. If someone has been on hospice for 4 months, hasn't eaten in 3 weeks, they're probably not going to have a whole lot to go, right? They're already going to be fairly desiccated. So, 72 hours is the general rule of when the body starts to internally feed on itself. That would be the real decomposition. So we have at least 3 days. And when you think about religious tradition, right? Everything happened in 3 days. That's because when, you have someone who's died, in 3 days you're going, yeah, it's time. You can see it in the recess of the face and so on. That's when you just know it's time.
So there are no statutory
There
rules?
are no rules whatsoever. You could keep someone as long as you can keep them viable. Yeah, I mean, there's a case, I'm trying to think what state it is right now, but there's a case, I got a call about this from, I think from the state police there a few months ago, and there was a gentleman whose mom had died, and they were refusing to let him do something, and I can't remember what it was, and he said, okay, well, fine, I'm good, and he bought a freezer, put it in his new property, right, because you can't have someone in a refrigeration unit in a home that you live in that particular state. I mean, who came up with that rule? And so he bought a freezer, put it on an empty house, and so he's sheltering the body in a refrigerated area for, until he could bury her this summer. And it was just like, okay, the things people will go to. But in the meantime, he kept her home for a couple of weeks. There was a case in Connecticut that just got resolved a few weeks ago about a son who wanted to bury his mom on green burial land, or I think family land that they wanted to set aside. And Connecticut is one of those kind of tough states. It's got some little quirky rules. And so he was fighting to do that, and he kept her home for as long as he could, and then he brought her to a refrigeration unit. So months and months later, they finally put her to rest on the family property. So there are different techniques we can use to keep the body above ground. We have to remember, too, our fear of all of this is really unreasonable when we consider that less than 100 years ago, if somebody died, you would then, keep them in the front parlor. Everyone would come and see them. You would do all the things that you do. Didn't have a whole lot, didn't have any AC, didn't have any of that stuff. And then you took them out to the barn and put them on sawhorses and waited until the ground was thawed enough so that you could dig it up and put them over there. It was just common, it's just normal. So our fear that dead bodies are suddenly going to ooze like they do in horror movies is kind of crazy. But again, back to the condition of the body, that is going to impact how much time you want to keep that person home and how much, purging and cleaning and that kind of thing you're going to have to do. But, it's all common sense. It's all stuff that we know. It's internal. We know this already. We've just lost touch with it. It's amazing to me what happens when there is a dead body in a room and people will come in, usually, some people will charge right in, the get-her-dones will come on in, and they'll start doing what just comes naturally. Just what you would do with a newborn baby, right? They're helpless, they need bathing. Oh, I know what to do. I know how to operate a washcloth. Good to go. You'll have the guys who stand in the hallway going, yeah, I'm not going any further. When you can get them past, and they realize that there's nothing to be afraid of, nothing smells, nothing's gonna bother them or hurt them in any way, they'll pick it up and elbow other people out of the way and start doing the job because we all know how to do it. So it's just giving ourselves permission to do it that seems to be the real, once we get rid of all this legal stuff, all this legal fear and all of this marketing fear, we find ways to simply tap into what is the most natural thing in the world. Yeah.
You said there are only 3 cemeteries in Vermont that allow green burial?
There are 3 that are coming online that are going to be allowing green burial. They're not there yet. They're rewriting their bylaws.
Because I know at Meeting House Hill Cemetery in Brattleboro has green burial.
Right. Yeah, I didn't mention them, but they only bury for people in their own congregation. Correct? Have they changed that?
Meeting House Hill is right.
Wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. That was not the case until recently.
But the South Newfane Cemetery doesn't have any rules against green burial either.
They don't have vault requirements?
No.
See, this is another category that we don't really talk about much, but those are the vaultless cemeteries.
Yeah.
And there are vaultless cemeteries that never wrote into their bylaws that a vault was required. And those are the ones we're trying to unearth so that we can say, hey, this is really more you know, this is normal.
We're actually one of the trustees there.
Wonderful.
We're actually, there's no rule against it. We've never been asked to do one.
Right.
So we're sort of at this point,
Yeah.
I guess we allow it.
And that's happened, you know, we have some up in the northern part of New Hampshire too, where, and one that is situated, interestingly enough, on state-owned land. And we had someone whose family cemetery was on that state-owned land about a year ago. And, you know, we thought we were going to have to go through this big process to get someone buried there. And went to the state and said, what are we going to do? And they said, well, yeah, it's a family cemetery, go for it. So unless we ask, we don't know how it's going to go. And people, I'm always saying to people, you're the ones who are boots on the ground. You're the ones who have to go to your own cemetery, find their bylaws, find out if it's even in the bylaws that they require things like vaults. And if they don't, then, you know, you're good to go. Or, and one of the three that I'm talking about that I know of particularly are cemeteries that have required vaults in the past, and they're in the process of redoing and relaxing their bylaws so that they can provide that service. And that's different from the vaultless, so he's, you know, kind of different, but yay for you. Yeah.
Well, since 80% of the people died many years ago, they were, you know, we always have to put dirt on top of where they finally collapsed.
Right, yeah. But you know why? Because they first made the vaults out of wood. Duh.
Yeah.
And so the part of the group of Caring for Our Own is trying to accumulate all the knowledge about this and give it to the library in Brattleboro, obviously, if you're interested, and have that information available.
Yeah, we're, from the Green Burial Council point of view and from my New Hampshire group, I keep the list of all the green burial cemeteries in the country and Canada. And I disseminate them to all these groups and lots of other groups and so on. So the more I can get on that list, the more, you know, and I do make the distinction, if you let me know about your cemetery being vaultless, here's the other piece though, if it's a municipal cemetery, do you allow people from out of town to be buried there?
Cemetery Association.
Then bingo, you're good to go. And those are the things we need to ferret out, you see, because a lot of towns will say, yeah, we'll do it this way, but only people who have long-standing relationship here or, you know, were born here. I mean, it's incredible. The rules, right? So the more we can find and we can get out there, the more it's going to normalize this so that people understand that it's...
I would just like to reiterate that I wasn't aware of what was happening there right under our nose here in South Newfane. We are constantly being asked. There have been practically a dozen families now who have not been able to have their wishes followed through on because it's taken so long for us to get the approvals we were looking for. We knew about Meeting House Cemetery. We didn't know that a possible referral could have been in South
There
Newfane.
tend to be, you know, groups of families that have been associated with South Newfane for a long time, but there's no restriction.
So it would just be, I mean, if we could talk more about how people that come to us might be appropriate for the service that you would provide, potentially. So just, again, the word of mouth and recognizing that we're a community of common interest, of shared values here, and how can we best support what families here would be most appropriate.
I was interested in finding someone else who's been in a mixed cemetery like we would end up being, because we don't know what the implications are.
Yeah.
The mounding process, is this something, you know, is our lawnmower going to have?
And I've got it
Things
all
like
laid
that.
out for you. I've been working with what's his, lost his first name, Patrick Healy, who's the head of the Cemetery Association for the state of Vermont and New England, I think. He might still be. He helped me put together how to be a hybrid cemetery. So we've got that. It's online at the Green Burial Cemetery. If you leave me information, I can send you those that stuff directly. That was what I was going to say, was that we need your support to get other Green Burial Cemeteries up and going, but you need support too, because this isn't something that we're commonly used to doing. And most cemetery operators if they have been having vaults, whether they're required or not, really, you're moving into different territory because it's different types of maintenance. It's still maintenance, but it's a different kind of maintenance. You know, it's and the financial aspect and so on. And yes, we've got a whole lot of other ones out there that have already broken ground who can help. So
Most of our burials now are cremation.
yep, that's another piece. Yeah. Sorry, you've been wanting to talk for a while.
Okay, so from Guilford, the cemetery commissioner, and then land surveyor also, so I've been involved in a lot of different
Wonderful.
areas of it, but we don't have any rules about how the burial should take place. We take care of 16 old cemeteries, but we do allow burials in the old cemeteries. But it's mostly cremation remains, just because we don't know how complete the stones represent all the graves that are in the old cemetery.
Hey, I hear you, brother, because I'll tell you, I grew up with a mom and dad who were cemetery commissioners in the East Montpelier, and I always tell people that the air was blue over the dining room table because of the cussing that was going on with my mother, who was trying to write books about all of this stuff, which she finally was able to do, but the bodies were never where the records said they were, or the records were all moldy and, you know, all that kind of stuff. So no, we don't know what's there. So that's another whole group of cemeteries that are starting to be explored. Ed Bixby, who runs Steelmantown Cemetery in New Jersey, took over a place where his little brother had been buried in a basket. And it's sort of a mix of everything, but mostly historical cemetery. And he took it over and has turned it into one of the most successful natural burial cemeteries in the country. And he now has 3 more. He's got Historic Columbian in Portland, Oregon, and he's got Purísima in Santa Cruz, California. This is taking over these old cemeteries, figuring out where the bodies were buried, finding out, you know, cleaning them up and reusing them, which is honestly the basic premise for natural burial, is that we aren't going to take up land forever. We don't, you know, it's this very American idea that we have the right to own, or that we are entitled to own property for eternity. And, you know, once you put a concrete box in there and you put a metal box inside it, you know, you're really not going anywhere ever. But if we're burying bodies and we're doing it right, and we're putting it at the right level and so on, and all of the factors are in place, in 20 years and, you know, in 2 months, I mean, depending on where you are, we have evidence that breakdown, decomposition of the body can occur very quickly in the right circumstances. And so, but, you know, we have family and so on, so we're going to keep on going. But, you know, 20 years, 50 years, whatever, it's just soil. We can rebury in that space. If we can eliminate that we're so special feeling about where we put our bodies. One of the things I also want to mention is recomposition. You might have heard about recomposition, recompose. It's Katrina Spade, who's from the Upper Valley, and she's put together this project that has now been proven after several years of research, and was just passed a month ago by Governor Jay Inslee in the state of Washington. Recomposition facilities are about to be built. And what it is the same process that we use in green burial. It's just accelerated a little bit above ground. So bodies go into a particular type of organic material. It's moved, so it's moving, which is different from, you know, in situ in graves. But the end product in 30 days is fully decomposed, nutrient-rich compost. And it's the urban answer to green burial, and the reason green burial stays viable is because of the conservation aspect, right? We're conserving and preserving and restoring land. They're trying to dispose of bodies in the most environmentally friendly way. And this whole rise in cremation is probably the most detrimental environmentally of any of the practices we have taken on at the level that we've taken them on. King County in Washington State is 99% cremation. We are up in the 60s here now in New England.
Could you say a little bit about why cremation is so non-environmentally friendly?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about it a little bit, but, you know, it's a somewhere around 200 pounds of CO2 per person that's going up. All that mercury that's in our amalgam fillings is going up with all the other heavy metals that we've accumulated. It's just, there's so much about it, and it's not just those things that are going up into the air and down into our streams. Again, it's not just the physical part, it's not just the scientific part, it's also the human part. And what the recomposition allows us to do is the same thing that green burial allows us to do, which is to participate in the process. These facilities will have areas where the family can come, bring the body, and have service, and be the ones who put the body into their cubicle. Come back later, then have that material to compost. These are ideas that sound wacky, except what's so not wacky about burning a body at high temperatures? 1900 degrees for 2 to 3 hours. That's a lot of fossil fuel.
I was just going to ask, what kind of global warming does that do?
Yeah, it's enormous.
On a mass scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And as that number goes higher, it's going to be more difficult for us to justify doing it that way, particularly as we have new processes. But it's all about the way we think about it. So, you had one more?
I have two questions.
Yeah.
Does green burial and natural burial, are those synonyms, or is there a difference between those two terms?
Yeah, it's always a good question, and we've worked really hard on the Green Burial Council website, and you'll find more information there. Green burial tends to just talk about things that are green as stated by the Federal Trade Commission. They've got their own definition for what's green. Natural burial is, it's essentially the same thing, but it covers all of these different areas. Okay, green means it's green, it's environmentally friendly. Natural burial is a specific level. We have hybrids in conventional cemeteries. We have natural burial cemeteries that are cemeteries where we bury naturally. And then we have conservation level cemeteries where we bury naturally, but we have conservation element to it. So it sounds a little complicated, but you can see what we need is all of them. We need all of these different flavors and types, because the most important thing for people when they're burying someone is that they be buried in a place that makes sense to them, that they can feel. They need a sense of place. If we have one conservation cemetery in all of New England, who's driving? The closest one to me is in Maine. And I'm not going to Maine first of all, I'm not going to drive all the way there with my fossil fuel car to bury myself to be green in a place where no one associates me, right? I would prefer to be buried in as close to my hometown as possible, which is why having municipal cemeteries, private cemeteries, church cemeteries, and so on, having them open up space for this is critically important, both to the families and to the success of the movement.
So my other question is a practical question. If you already have an easement on your land for the electric company to get to power lines, can you do double duty on that easement?
Sure. When we're talking about easements in this regard, all we're saying is that you're giving people permission to walk from here to there. So, do you want to bury someone near a power line? So that's your question you really need to be asking. Or do you want to be burying them someplace, bucolic and, peaceful and so on, in which case you draw a map from where people can park to that area.
I think another really relevant question about easement is the Vermont Land Trust is currently looking at what Higher Ground Conservation Cemetery Association is doing as a potential template for how they could be working with other conservation landowners in the state of Vermont. Right now, Vermont Land Trust doesn't honor conservation cemetery as a conservation strategy under their current scope of vision.
Which is quite common. And in fact, in October, I'm going to be speaking at what's called the Rally. And it's the Land Trust Alliance, where all of these state alliances all belong. Because they are finally, after all these years, I have to tell you, my husband and I have been very involved with the Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy and all of that kind of stuff for years and years. And I've been trying to float this idea, and I get kicked under the table to, keep quiet. Nobody wants to hear about it yet. Well, guess what? They want to hear about it now. because it is a conservation strategy. It is resonating with people. It is really important to people. And again, that's another thing. Do you want to do home burial where, you know, there it is, or do you want to be supporting the conservation and preservation of land for eternity? I mean, that's really that motivates a lot of people. And it motivates them. It's one thing to be buried green in your town cemetery, but for a lot of people, they'd be willing to pay a premium to be buried on conservation land because the ideal of conservation is so important to them. So, you know, again, that sense of place, that sense of contributing back to the earth is an essential part of all this work. So I didn't mean to get into green burial on you, but I'm glad we did, and thanks for your patience. We're over time, but I really appreciate you coming. And please take whatever you need here, and it'll lead you on the, we've left a lot of breadcrumbs for you to follow so you can get to the next step. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks.